Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I'd like to discuss the latest row that Priti Patel is having against decency and her own department as her plans to murder innocents hits another little snag. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So Brexit was supposed to be about, amongst other things, or other contradictory things even, taking back control of our borders. However, as I'll be reiterating again in the next video, I think, it's actually been about keeping our borders wide open. So in order to distract people's attentions away from the massive smuggling routes into Britain that we have created, Priti Patel has taken to joining Nigel Farage in shouting at the sea, specifically demonising asylum seekers fleeing war and persecution. Now, one of her latest schemes was to equip border patrol officers with jet skis in order to prevent migrants making it to the British shore, harassing the boats. Why jet skis? Because you can't rescue people in distress very easily on a jet ski. And if they were equipped with patrol boats, more usual, you can haul people inside and bring them to shore if they're in trouble. In line with common decency and, when it comes down to it, international maritime law. Priti Patel doesn't want that. In fact, she wants the border patrols to be nudging these migrant boats back out towards the sea, making their deaths more likely. This is, of course, bang against international law. Any border patrol officer who does this is in breach of the law, both international and domestic. No problem, said our enterprising Home Secretary. I'll just make it fine in British law. You'll not be prosecuted. Only this would be a breach of the Human Rights Act, so she can't. No problem, said Dominic Raab, our enterprising new Justice Secretary, because I'm going to abolish the Human Rights Act. Of course, that hasn't happened yet, but that's the trajectory that they want to take. But in the meantime, Patel wants her border force to keep pushing back migrant boats. So she came up with a plan for this. But in a report in the Times this weekend, it explained that the border force has been trying to explain to their boss that a policy cannot actually work in practice. So according to the report, the only way this can work legally, so the plan is this, right? So the tactic has to be used in a particular section of the channel where the commander is in charge has been assured that the French are on hand to escort the migrant boat elsewhere. In other words, they want to play a game of ping pong with the French Navy. And these conditions are not going to be routinely met, if ever, because the French authorities have said, don't be ridiculous, this is illegal. And they're not going to engage in this nonsense. So basically the plan is a non-starter. The report also cited an example of when Australian Greek officials tried to do something similar. So apparently this is not a new idea, and Patel thought it was a good idea to adopt a tried and tested and repeatedly failed strategy. See, the migrants reportedly just threatened to jump overboard and if the tactic was attempted. Well, that would mean they're in distress and the authorities are duty-bound to rescue them. Remember, the migrants don't give a crap about their boat. Many of the boats are barely seaworthy as it is, and officers cannot risk being responsible for the deaths of migrants. Legal, you see. So Patel and Raab, between them, may well be intent on clearing it all up in British law to make officers immune to prosecution. That won't really work for an intelligent officer, will it? Another MP apparently backed Patel by saying that if the current officers won't do as they're told, they'll be replaced by people who will. Okay, well, let's just put morality to one side for a moment. And this is Brexit Britain we're talking about. Let's just say that they can find people to do this job who have no human feeling. After all, it can't only be government ministers that have no empathy. I'm sure that there are people willing to do this sort of job from a moral point of view. But, they may lack empathy for others, but do they lack it for themselves? Do they really fancy going to prison for it? But they won't be prosecuted, won't they? How can we be so sure? See, it doesn't matter what legislation this government passes. They can't change one line of international law. Now, I don't know how realistic it would be for international arrest warrants to be issued for these officers, but, wouldn't there be a danger that they could be at risk of arrest if they ever left the UK? Now, that might be unlikely. I would imagine, I'm not an expert on this, I would imagine that's unlikely, because without the cooperation of the British authorities in any investigation, how would you mount an investigation that would find out which officer or officers were responsible? But what about when this government falls? all regimes end in the end, and then those who committed crimes under their protection suddenly lose that protection, don't they? And we know from history that under such circumstances, the "I was only following orders" defence doesn't really work. So even if they did find officers who were willing and able to carry out this monstrous policy, they'd still have to find ones that were stupid enough to think that somehow they will continue to be immune from prosecution even when this government falls. And the problem is that the government and complicit media are deliberately misinforming the public about the facts. Even in this Times article, which reported the situation, they still allowed their readers to be misinformed about the legal position. The article quoted one of Patel's appointments saying that these migrants are risking their lives making these dangerous journeys and that they should claim asylum in the first safe country that they reach. So there was a couple of false statements there. I mean, the quote's fine, quote, this is what the person has said, of course the paper should quote it. But then the article should have gone on to point out how this statement is inconsistent, especially with the law. The migrants are making dangerous crossings. It's not making it less dangerous by nudging them back. The reason it's dangerous is because we refuse to facilitate safer passages for them. We are the ones who are placing the danger in their way in the hopes that they will turn back. But they won't turn back because they are fleeing terrors, the likes of which most of us only read about. Secondly, it is not the case that these migrants should seek asylum in the first safe country they reach. Not what the rules say at all. Our authorities say that because we are far away from the most unstable parts of the world where most asylum seekers would hail from. Parts of the world whose instability has often been poked by our government, or at the very least not sufficiently helped. But you cannot expect the ring of safe countries around, because what's the inevitable consequence? It's like, oh, well, you should go to this country that's right next to the trouble spots. Can't expect a small number of countries to take all the asylum seekers in the world. It's not sustainable. We all have to do our part. And despite how these things are reported in the press, we take hardly any refugees. They'll be saying, oh, we take more than our fair share of asylum seekers. You see this repeated. No, we don't. And international law is quite clear. Actually, British law as well, as it happens at the moment, but they can change British law. A refugee can claim asylum wherever they may feel safe. Now, asylum can be denied if their claim doesn't seem credible. Yes, of course. But the claim can be heard anywhere. Groups of countries can work together, of course, to distribute their share of asylum seekers to make sure that no countries are overwhelmed. After a major crisis, particularly this happens, of course. But that doesn't help Patel or the Gammon conspiracy here. We're not even in the top 10 of asylum seeker destinations in Europe, never mind the world. In Europe, stable continent like Europe, we're not even in the top 10 of asylum seekers taken per capita. And in terms of comparisons, we do very poorly, can some. Part of this is the fact that, as I say, we are a country on the far north of a stable continent. The ones that have very low numbers of asylum seekers per capita, of course, are the countries that are far away from the main trouble spots. We don't have that many asylum seekers trying to make it to Britain, despite what the papers will say. But that doesn't fit with the narrative that, this is all part of that British exceptionalism, isn't it? Britain is the best place in the world. So of course it makes sense that people from the rest of the world would desperately want to come here and live on this enlightened island. That's the way the thinking goes. That's why this narrative is pushed. It gets us to think, it makes sense that they'd want to come here because we're such a great country. But they mustn't, you see. They mustn't. This is why the stories are blown out of all proportion. If anything, the magnification has increased since Brexit. I thought leaving the EU was supposed to stop all this so-called migrant crisis. They're bellyaching about it even worse than before. What's going on with that? And until the media start to report the facts, people will continue to believe that there is a crisis when there isn't, and that the government are the only ones trying to do something about it, even when their proposed solutions are horrific. So horrific that the orders simply cannot be obeyed, whether due to moral or, more usually, legal constraints. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button if you'd like to support the channel further. Please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.